Ja, guten Abend. Good evening, everyone. Ich werde jetzt gleich ins Englische wechseln, da wir heute einen Vortrag in englischer Sprache hören. So, welcome everyone to the lecture series Cultures of Images in the Digital Era, Practices, Aesthetics, Genres. I'm very honored and excited that Paul Frosh is my guest tonight. A very warm welcome to Paul. If you want, you can already switch on your video. Before I will introduce, there he is. Hi, Paul. Before I will introduce you, Paul, please let me first repeat some technical details because we might have some new participants tonight. So please leave your cameras and microphones switched off during the lecture. After Paul's presentation, we will discuss with him. You can ask your question by writing it in the chat or by entering the plus sign in the chat and then ask in person. In that case, please wait until I call you to speak before switching on your mic. Please feel free to pose your questions in English or in German. I will try to translate the questions into English then. I would also like to inform you that we record the lecture. So now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Paul Frosh. He is professor in the Communications and Journalism Department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Paul is a prolific and influential academic in the fields of communication and media theory, with a special emphasis on visual culture and an absolute expert on the topic of this lecture series. He has published extensively on photography and cultural production, on consumer culture, on the aesthetics of television, on digital media, as well as on witnessing and testimonies. He's very well known and widely cited for his concept of media witnessing. He published the influential volume Media Witnessing, Testimony in the Age of Mass Communication with Amit Pinchevsky in 2008. The first book to theorize the relationship between contemporary media and practices of witnessing after 9/11, and a landmark for witnessing theory. Now already in the second edition, as I saw. In 2016, he published the book The Image Factory, Consumer Culture, Photography and the Visual Content Industry, on the central role of stock photography in our visual culture and the increasing control that related industries gain. His recent book, The Poetics of Digital Media, was published in 2018 with Polity Press. The Poetics of Digital Media is a groundbreaking study of media practices, digital images and interfaces in social media communication, with chapters on selfies, tags, screenshots, and more. And as Lily Shuliaraki said of his book, it will be a key point of reference in the study of digital culture for years to come. Paul has an admirable ability to address technological and media theoretical questions in connection with social, symbolic, and aesthetic ones, which is why his research is so incredibly integrative for many disciplines. Paul's writings provide great food for thought, and it has also been a great inspiration for my own work on image testimonies and effective witnessing. Currently, Paul is working on a joint research project about iconic photographs, Israeli media, and Israeli collective memory. Last but not least, I of course also want to mention his latest book from 2019, which is in German, good for us, for our audience, and is a translated extraction from the Poetics of Digital Media. And it's in the book series that you all know by now, Digitale Bildkulturen, edited by Wolfgang Ulrich and Anne-Kathrin Kohut. And I think they are also here. And it has, by the way, this great color. So today, Paul will be presenting on the subject of screenshots. It's with great pleasure, Paul, that we welcome you in this forum and look forward to your presentation. Please enjoy, everyone. And Paul, the Zoom floor is yours.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
So I'm now going to do share screen. But before I do that, I'd like to say, I don't know if it's afternoon or evening for you. It's evening for me.
Evening.
And so good evening, everybody. And it's a great pleasure to be invited to speak to you as part of this really fascinating series. I'm only sorry that I'm not able to understand many of the lectures because my German is lacking, shall we say. But I'm extremely grateful to Kerstin for the invitation and for all of you, to all of you for coming. So I'm now going to share my screen and I'm going to speak probably for around half an hour, I'm guessing. And then we will take questions. Okay, so I'm now going to share my screen and I hope it's all going to work. Yep, can you see that rather boring slide?
Yeah, we can see
Everyone
it.
can see that. Okay, great. Okay,
Thanks.
so my talk today will take as its starting point a long chapter on screenshots in my last book, which is called The Poetics of Digital Media. There you go. It looks very pretty, as you can see. As Kerstin said, the chapter has been translated and republished as a book in German. And I'm very grateful to Wolfgang Ulrich and Anna-Kathrin Kurt for making that possible. The chapter analyzes screenshot in order to exemplify what I called the poetics of media, by which I mean the way media objects and media technologies populate and produce worlds of action and experience, and have become a kind of technologized second nature, which we inhabit most, if not all of the time. And yes, I am including in that our dream lives. I was particularly interested in how screenshots seem to be everywhere in our culture, constantly in use, and they are extremely useful, almost indispensable, including in putting together the presentation you are watching. But I was also struck by the fact that they had attracted very little attention, either from scholars or in public discourse. They are, I said, the unglamorous workhorses of digital culture, as opposed to selfies, which are both glamorous and notorious at the same time. The screenshot is extraordinarily pervasive as a way of quoting from digital media, mainly but not only within digital media, while largely escaping our notice as a distinctive cultural practice with particular assumptions and effects. It's still true to say that there has been barely a single case of public or scholarly controversy over whether a particular screenshot is true or has been manipulated, even though screenshots are no less manipulable and no less ideological than regular digital photographs. So to quote Wendy Chun, our media matter most when they seem not to matter at all. This is precisely the condition of the screenshot. In paying attention to the screenshot, we are still very much looking at the overlooked. In today's talk, then, I'm going to recap some of the things I said in that chapter. So my apologies for any repetition of what you already know, and to a degree provide a kind of auto-critique of some of what I wrote, foregrounding a few reservations. But I'm also going to use the screenshot to think in more depth about some of the things I hinted at, but did not really develop. So I apologize for what is in a sense false advertising about this lecture. Yes, I am going to talk about screenshots, but mainly because I find them a very useful object to think with about some other things. In particular, I'm going to use a screenshot to try and think about remediation as a media-focused mode of cultural memory that has existential and other ramifications. And I'm also going to suggest that this mnemonic version of remediation is not only more than a semiotic process, but is a historically variable and freighted indicator of the centrality of media to our lives. In this process, the relationship between screenshots and photography will be drawn even further into the foreground. Let me start by saying that I'm going to be slightly broadening the scope of my discussion of the screenshot, and this broadening is indebted to the research of several others who are rapidly developing a field of research activity around what we could call cameraless photography in digital contexts. I'm thinking of work by scholars like Poremba and Giddings on in-game photography, and especially Winfried Gerling's genealogy of the digital screenshot in relation to the cameraless images of pre-digital screens. For instance, the screens used for displaying X-ray images, or photographs of cathode ray television screens. And in particular, his distinction between screen image photography, actual photographs of a screen taken by an external camera, and digital screenshots, created internally by the device on which the image is displayed. And that last category, digital screenshots, is what we normally mean when we talk about I screenshotted my WhatsApp conversation. More recently, Jan Svelch, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, has used some of these distinctions to argue for a continuum of photographic screen capture, which is his umbrella term for the phenomenon, between documentary or evidentiary screenshots on the one hand, and images with a more aesthetic, spectacular, and often promotional intent, which usually come from in-game photography. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So with this work in mind, let's return to the underlying question, which has an ontological bias, that I asked about screenshots in my book, and also to some of the answers I gave. I asked, what is a screenshot? Well, a simple answer is that a screenshot is a digital image taken of the screen, either whole or in part, of a digital device at a particular moment in time by the device itself. This is roughly the definition that Gerling gives. Technically, the screenshot is created by extracting the information from a computer or mobile device's frame buffer, a section of memory which stores the visual information displayed on the screen at a given moment, along with instructions to the device to interpret this information as an image file format like JPEG. Communicatively, however, the screenshot is something else entirely. In fact, we could say it is several things. It's a kind of digital document, a remediated photograph, and a mode of witnessing digital worlds. Now, you'll be seeing this slide a couple of times during the presentation, because this is the slide that I have reservations about. But anyway, here's a banal example of the screenshot as a digital document. A section from a recent article in Haaretz, which is a daily Israeli newspaper and website, about Trump disputing the outcome of the US presidential elections. It's banal, not just because Trump tweets almost all of the time, but also because much reporting on those tweets includes screenshots of those tweets, even when the articles also quote word for word from the tweets. So then the screenshot of the tweet acts as seeming evidence, reproducing what Lisa Gittelman has called the no-show function of documents. No, that's K-N-O-W, show function of documents in Western societies, particularly their centrality to the epistemic regimes of bureaucratic organizations, scientific discourse, and journalism, among others. Here is the well-known example I gave in the book. Now, this tweet, which became known as the Kopfweh tweet, appeared in Donald Trump's Twitter feed just after midnight on May the 31st, 2017. And what is important from our point of view is that it was deleted just before 6 a.m. on the same day. Since Trump had at that time around 31 million Twitter followers, many will have seen the tweet on the Twitter app, either from Trump himself or through retweets. Many others, however, would have heard about it or seen it on media outlets beyond Twitter, where it was widely reported, discussed, and mocked. These outlets did not only report on Trump's tweet, of course, they almost invariably reproduced the tweet itself by means of screenshots. And these screenshots, like the one shown here, did not just reproduce the text of the Kofeve tweet. They displayed Trump's words along with all the incidental details, the additional signs and information that appear on the Twitter interface itself, such as Trump's name, his photo, the time and date of the tweet, the number of retweets and likes at the time of the screenshot. The screenshot, at least in this case, signals its own contingency as part of an ongoing digital world. Notwithstanding the emphasis on the interminable mobility, flux, and performativity of digital culture among several scholars, notably researchers such as Lev Manovich on software culture and Herzl and Marie in their thought-provoking theorization of the digital image, what the Kofeve image shows us is not merely the importance of the screenshot as evidence, but as a material form providing communicative fixity. For the screenshot is precisely an enduring ephemeral, another phrase from Wendy Chung. While it is the perpetual product of real-time computational performances, the image you see before you is not static. Its communicative value is premised on its relative fixity over time and across digital contexts. Like the printout, the screenshot brings fixity and regularity to the incessant stream of digital performances, including for applications that we know well like Snapchat and Instagram stories, which deliberately seek to defy permanence. Hence, the screenshot of the Kofeve tweet was not redundant, since it acted as evidence that the Kofeve tweet had in fact existed, even after it had been deleted, something a mere quotation of the words could not do. Lest we conclude that this documentary function of the screenshot is restricted to journalism, or more narrowly, news reports of Trump's, let me turn your attention to a recent article by Victoria James on the everyday use of screenshots among teenagers. You can see the citation on the slide. Central to her findings is the widespread but also gendered and normatively regulated use of screenshots as evidence, not only of the occurrence of particular online interactions and conversations, but also of their precise details. Those of you who have read my book and have listened to me so far today may well be asking yourselves, okay, but what has he got to say that's new? Well, this is where I need to begin to revise some of what I've said so far. Again, in part, thanks to the work I mentioned earlier. Have a look at these images by photographer Leo Sang. You know what? I'm going to go through them again slower because I think that they reward a little bit of time looking at them. They come from a virtual reality photography project, which is well known to those in this field and researching it, created from versions of the computer games Bad Company and Battlefield. I don't play either of these games. In fact, I don't play computer games at all. I leave that to my son. But they are, to my mind, stunningly beautiful and interesting images. They are examples of in-game photography, and they are screenshots in the sense that they were created from the devices on which the images were seen. Now, we could, of course, claim that these are documents, but I think that would be stretching the category much too far. They in fact conform to what's just called transformative screenshot practices. They are generally created for promotional or artistic purposes, and they are transformative in that they frequently overtly manipulate the image to create particular effects in ways that would undercut the evidentiary transparency claimed by the earlier screenshots we looked at. Here is Leonardo Sang's, the main homepage of his website, and I do recommend that people go and visit it. So, what is a screenshot? I would argue that these kind of images are digital spectacles, by which I mean that they are created to emphasize their own aesthetic character as images and the visual dimensions of their referent worlds as picturable phenomena. The indexical and iconic relationship to what they depict, relationships of physical connection or of imputed connection and of similarity, while not entirely irrelevant, as we shall see, is secondary to this spectacular purpose. Interestingly, this revision does not undermine, though it does alter, the next claim that I make, that the screenshot is a remediated photograph. Technically, of course, the screenshot is not a photograph at all. It is not produced by light rays making contact with a photosensitive surface, whether chemical or electrical. Nevertheless, the screenshot is a powerful remediation of the photographic image, in that it reproduces conventions of photographic production and viewing that invite it to be treated as a photograph. Most obvious here is the name itself, screenshot, which alludes, of course, to the photographic snapshot. Equally important, however, is that when I take a screenshot, my phone or my computer make the sound of a shutter, just as they do when I take an actual photograph with my phone, even though in neither case is a mechanical shutter involved. This equivalence between photographs and screenshots is further reinforced by the fact that my screenshots are stored by my phone along with all my other photos. This is true, of course, of my everyday documentary photographs, screenshots. But how are the spectacular or transformative screenshots we saw remediated photographs? In at least two ways. First, in relation to the modes of action. I think we're missing a slide. Hang on a second. No? Okay. First, in relation to the modes of action required by the ways in which spectacular transformative images are made. This is, in many cases, through specially designed in-game photo software, such as NVIDIA's Ansel. Not only does the product name, presumably after Ansel Adams, reference photography history and, of course, a canonized photographer, but the terminology used throughout both the publicity and the software itself refers to the medium continually, almost unreflexively. This is also true of the photo mode built into several games natively, as we see in this screenshot I took from a video where British landscape photographer Pete Rowbottom describes the similarities between his work in the physical world and in the game world of Death Stranding. Here you can see one of the interfaces with the game's photo mode. The game world, then, is not meant simply to be played in, but to be seen and captured photographically. This kind of photography is also sometimes called virtual tourism. It is increasingly designed as a photographic spectacle. The second way that these images are remediated photographs is the repeated claim that they are created by people who identify themselves as photographers, who, like Leo Sang and Pete Rowbottom, have simply wandered with their training and compositional and aesthetic competencies and their publicly declared and privately felt artistic and professional identities across the increasingly porous boundary between the physical and the virtual. what does this revision mean for thinking about how screenshots remediate photography? Well, the first alteration is that the documentary screenshot, though not an indexable image, benefits from and in turn reaffirms the evidentiary power that has long been ascribed to the photograph. This is, of course, connected to the no-show function of documents more generally. And as with documents, the evidentiary power of photography is a technocultural, ideological, and institutional construct, as generations of thinkers and researchers on the topic have repeatedly averred. The upshot of this is that since photographic evidentiary power is constructed rather than technologically inherent, it can also be transferred to technologies and images which do not exactly share photography's technical or semiotic character, but are, like the screenshot, repeatedly treated as kinds of photographs. A little later on, I'm going to call this transference relocation. What I've just described is also true for the spectacular screenshots we have seen, except that what is transferred is less the evidentiary power of photography, but its spectacular power, by which I mean photography constructs the world as always already picturable, as a world picture, in Heidegger's famous phrase, where its objects are predefined as things to be seen and composed before an external gaze. Similarly, the spectacular screenshots construct and reaffirm the pictoriality of the worlds they capture and embellish, just as they foreground the pleasures of the techniques and technologies described photographically that they use to generate their images. Now, in these examples, a lot of pressure is being put on the word remediation, and I need to clarify a little more what I mean by this. Bolter and Grusin define the term roughly to refer to how media cite, mimic, and refashion other media, especially older media, primarily according to two logics: transparent immediacy, where the medium becomes invisible as a conduit for the content it presents, and hypermediacy, where the presence and activity of the medium itself are foregrounded. We could argue that the documentary screenshot remediates photography transparently, whereas the spectacular screenshot does so hypermediately, if that's a word, though I'm not sure that the distinction holds completely across both these forms. For Bolter and Grusin, remediation is not restricted to the digital era, but is a recurrent and permanent phenomena of media and mediation as such. Interestingly and contrastingly, Lev Manovich argues against his position in his discussion of the computer as a metamedium that can simulate all existing media, obviously including photography, add its own range of programmable transmedia operations, for example, copy, cut, paste, save, etc., and even produce entirely new media. Manovich, therefore, adds a significant historical dimension to the idea of remediation through an account of the work of Alan Kay and his Xerox PARC team in the 1970s, effectively arguing that it was not inevitable that the computer should develop into a machine for producing remediations of other media. In other words, remediation takes work. Well, what kind of work does remediation involve? I think that Francesco Cassetti's notion of media relocation gives us a good idea. Focusing on cinema, Cassetti argues that a medium can be relocated to new spheres and new configurations as a cultural experience, autonomously of the technical apparatus, projection, darkened theatre, with which it was previously associated. Hence, according to him, one can experience cinema on the screen of an iPhone. Relocation is possible in part through remediation, but more significantly because cinema is a cultural experience that has become historically sedimented, That is, it is recognizable as a distinctive mode of representing and relating to the world. The habits formed by going to the cinema, embodied and social modes of spectatorship, generational memory of cinema, and the social image of cinema circulating in public and specialist discourses, all of these contribute to practices of recognition that sustain what he calls an idea of cinema. It is this idea of cinema which, tentatively, since Cassetti describes relocation as an imperfect and uncertain process, enables the medium not only to persist, but to expand into new contexts. The relocated medium is thus reaffirmed as it is also transferred and expanded into new arenas. The screenshot, I would argue, needs to be understood not simply as a remediation, but also as a relocation of photography as a medium that persists, notwithstanding the radical changes to its core technologies in the past few decades. The screenshot is thus an agent as well as a beneficiary of the cultural memory of photography. Broadly speaking, photography survives radical change by being systematically remembered and reproduced discursively and materially through phenomena such as the screenshot. This view, of course, alters the conventional relations between photography and memory, shifting emphasis away from photographic images as vehicles of individual and shared remembering, and instead giving priority to cultural memory as the framework through which photography itself persists, expands, and flourishes, along with the values and worldviews previously associated with it. Hence, in making such claims, I'm bringing together photography with the concept of cultural memory and insisting that the screenshot is a medium, if you like, of transmission or transition across cultural and technological domains. More to the point, I'm going to claim that the memory of photography is not merely technical, but reproduces it as a mode or even a set of modes for representing and relating to the world. The cultural memory of photography's past is therefore functionally shaped by the contexts of the present. It is elastic, plural, and contested. And among those contexts is the centrality of the screens in our experience. Now, why is this persistence and relocation of photography through agents such as the screenshot more than merely technical, or more than merely the kind of formalistic citational procedure often indicated by remediation? I would argue that the remembered and relocated medium, because it is sedimented historically and within cultural memory, acts as an anchor for structured cultural constellations of epistemic and aesthetic schemas, social values, and behavioral scripts that are historically associated with it. For example, the documentary screenshot. This documentary screenshot is anchored by the structural cultural constellations of the documentary photograph. The recollection of photography therefore reanimates previously constituted protocols for representing and relating to the world. There are 5 principal cultural constellations that we can mention here. These aren't the only ones, and these aren't necessarily the ones that will be necessarily connected in the most overt ways to the screenshot, although some of them are. Consolidated in Western modernity, they are anchored and elicited through the memory and reproduction of photography in contemporary contexts. The first is, of course, evidentiary. Photography produces visible evidence of the world and instantiates epistemic ties between visibility and truth, And that can occur whether the world is deemed to be physical or digital. Spectacular. Photography designates the world as picturable, predefining its objects as things to be seen and composed before an observer and their gaze. Again, this world can be physical or digital. Expressive. Photography expands the repertoire and accessibility of aesthetic techniques and pictorial forms, potentially democratizing expressive activity among different populations. And I think we can save this for the discussion, but it's interesting to think about whether and to what extent screenshots do have a democratizing, if you like, expressive feature in the way that they are used among different populations. Ethical. This cultural constellation is connected to the idea that photography enables and perhaps forces encounters with others who are made visible across space and time, including with the self and other. And finally, temporal. Photography reconfigures temporal sensibilities by visually fragmenting and arresting the flux of time and producing new understandings and models of the memorable. Again, this can occur within physical or digital worlds. I'm going to clarify the significance of this relocation of photography by returning to another screenshot that I discuss in the book, again with apologies to those of you who know it, because I think it remains a foremost example of the power of relocation, particularly of the ethical constellation associated with physical photography. On Monday, the 9th of January, 2017, the front page of Yediot Achronot, one of Israel's most popular daily Hebrew newspapers, was devoted to the victims and survivors of an event which happened on the previous day. A Palestinian driver had deliberately driven his truck into a group of soldiers disembarking from a bus on a popular promenade in Jerusalem, killing 4 of them. What was unusual about the front page was that there was no traditional headline. Hebrew goes from right to left. This is the masthead of the newspaper, and then there is no headline. Instead, below the masthead, the entire upper half of the page was dominated by a screenshot from the smartphone of the mother of one of the dead soldiers, Shir Hajjaj. The screenshot shows her WhatsApp instant messaging application, and as described by the caption, here is the caption, the last message sent by Shir's mother to her daughter. The lines of text in the screenshot begin with the name of the person with whom contact is being attempted, including the name Shiri, her WhatsApp profile image, and the formula familiar to anyone who uses the app, last seen today at 12:39. Then there are these 2 messages which make up the main headline. Shiri, speak to me urgently, 13:47, and my darling, literally my life, speak to me, 16:46. And both of these lines are followed by 2 beige ticks. Here, the visualization and witnessing performed by the screenshot, and performed, I should add, in a print medium, produces a new version of what Barbie Zellitzer has called the about to die image that is traditionally associated with photography, and which combines its ethical and certainly its temporal constellations. The result is that the screenshot produces a sensibility that is extraordinarily powerful. It's poetic, both in the sense of Jacobson's definition of the poetic function of language, which stresses the material palpability of signs, but also Gambon's analysis of poesis as bringing forth into presence, unexpectedly producing a heightened encounter with the conditions of existence. part of the poetic encounter, part of the poetic power of this screenshot has to do with the tragic irony of a figure of speech no longer being figural. My life, my darling, literally my life, is used as a term of endearment among certain groups of Israel, and especially between parents and children. But here, of course, it raises the question, are you alive? Much of the poetic power also has to do with the screenshot's inclusion of commonplace indicators of social media connectivity and their sudden transformation. In particular, the word last, in last seen, suddenly given terrible finality. Above all, the presence of the two ticks and their telltale beige color, showing that the message has been sent but not read on the app by the intended recipient. This has, of course, since changed on WhatsApp. Because the intended recipient is no longer alive, and this message will never reach its destination. Now, of course, there are probably biographical factors explaining why I find this image, even several years later, still extremely powerful. Cultural proximity to those killed, a pervasive Israeli discourse about soldiers being our children, a resemblance in parental position to the mother of the soldier who has died. Two of my children have so far been conscripted into the army. Others who are less personally invested or find themselves on the other side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict may have very different feelings. And it's important, by the way, it's interesting, we can think about this image certainly in terms, of course, of Barth's classic distinction between the studium and the punctum, but it does raise also the question of how the relations between the studium and the punctum interact, and whether the punctum shoots across and fragments the studium, or whether it is in many ways dependent on an initial framing, whether emotionally, cognitively, or both, of the image before the punctum can take effect. However, while the intensity of this particular screenshot probably can't be universalized, it's functioning as an ethical and temporal mode of witnessing, grant it a kind of world disclosing power. The pervasiveness of the digital networks we use, their live registration of everyday interactions, mean that symbols such as the tick are no longer simply tokens of message delivery. They're not simply functional. They have been delegated with existential powers as indicators of life itself, or, to borrow an appropriate medical expression, as vital signs. And the screen on which these images flicker is the site to which these signs have become increasingly relocated. I'm going to conclude with the broader significance of specifying more closely the cultural, the activity of cultural memory, and in particular cultural memory of photography, as a key figure in the way the screenshot retains and expands photography into new domains. The first thing I'm going to say is that thanks to the proliferation of interactive mobile digital communication devices and their infrastructures, media penetrate our everyday lives and saturate our physical and symbolic environments, occupy our fantasies and dreams, put us to sleep and wake us up, excite us, locate us, remind us, record us, and distract us. For most of us in the global north, and many beyond it, media, as I said right at the beginning of this talk, are a technologized second nature, an overall environment encountered from early age as part of our primary experience. This ubiquity means that media are both the objects of intimate past experiences, as well as the ways through which those experiences are encountered preserved, and imagined. Media, therefore, such as photography, are therefore principal actors for memory and ongoing experience in highly mediated societies. More specifically, I will say that there are particular historical configurations which create moments of radical cultural instability and dynamism, where memory work around a medium becomes more urgent and overt. I think we can make a historical wager that we are living in such a configuration. If memory always travels, as Astrid Earle claims, it increasingly travels not simply through, but as media. And I think that this is part of what the screenshot does in our contemporary configuration. Thank you very much.